Welcome to video 2 in this series on the PSMT and how you can complete a PSMT really well. So let's move on to our next section, which is the language, layout and expectations for the PSMT. So let's get started. First of all, your PSMT has some layout constraints that we're setting as a college to help you not have to worry about them. First of all, when you open a new Word document, initially it's set up as a font size 11 and Calibri. We suggest you just stick with that. We suggest you just stick with the original margins. There is a 10-page limit for the PSMT, and I can't stress this enough. If you give us 11 pages, we can't mark the 11th, and it has happened a lot of times before. There is a maximum 2,000 word count for the PSMT as well, and this has some exclusions that I'll go through on the next page. But for now, what we're asking you to do is be considerate of this, because when you submit your PSMT through Turnitin, it will report back to us the full word count. And if you are over the word count, we need to check. Now, obviously, there's some exclusions. So if you're a little bit over, then probably you're fine. What we'd like you to do is to take out the exclusions and come up with your own word count and place that on your title page. It makes it a lot easier for us to check, and it allows us to just check that what you said and what Word is saying match up. Using graphs and images is perfectly fine, but we would expect you to provide a caption so that we understand where we're finding things. So you might say this is figure 1 or graph 1, and then we can come back and look for figure 1 or graph 1 where you reference that in the task. I would suggest reducing of graph size though, and the image size. You need to be considerate of what you need to show, but of course you only have 10 pages. So most graphs, in most cases, might fit nicely in about a quarter of a page. But it really depends. If you're doing, say, comparative box plots, well, this might need to be the width of the page, but actually not that tall. So there's a lot of different options for you to consider, but just make sure that you're not taking up too much spaces with your graphs and images. Definitely you are allowed to have an appendix, but everything in your appendix will not be marked. So just make sure that you've only got things in there that may be information or may provide evidence for something, such as if you've had to get an insurance quote as part of a budgeting PSMT, you might put a screenshot of the insurance quote in the appendix. Doesn't need to be applied for the marks, but it just means we can check that you've got the evidence for that. Okay, so here's some stuff straight from the QCAA Procedures and Policies Handbook, and it's all about the word length and the inclusions and exclusions to that word length and page count. So firstly, the inclusions are all words in the text of the response, titles, headings and subheadings, tables, figures, maps, diagrams, quotations, footnotes and endnotes. They're all included. The exclusions, though, are the title page, the contents page, and those two are really actually important for the page count. We don't include those. Abstract you won't have. Data in tables, figures and diagrams. If it's raw data, we actually expect you to put that in the appendix anyway because it does tend to clog up the pages, but it's not included. Bibliography and references are not included. Appendices are not included. We won't count the page numbers or the in-text citations if you have any. So there's some information there for you to take into account in terms of word length, and you can see the page count one there as well, has that information. So just have a quick read of that and make sure you're comfortable with that. And then when you're doing your word count and you're checking you only have 10 pages, you can refer back to this. So managing your response length. So I've sort of talked about this already, but it's your responsibility to be under 2,000 words because technically if you give us 2,002 words, we don't mark the last two. We mark it as if those two aren't there. We would love you to include a stated number of words at the beginning of the task. We will, of course, assist you because you will be given draft feedback. And so we will check your word count and your length count then. And, of course, particularly in your first and second PSMTs, we can really actively offer you guidance. If you have 2,500 words and you don't know what to cut out, please just come and speak to your teacher. We'll give you a hand with that. For your actual PSMT, though, which is the Unit 3 PSMT, we can't help you quite as much, so just keep that in mind. In terms of language and readability, we've got a few tips here. None of this is a definite you have to, but a few tips. Firstly, there is some information on the LMS where you can find documents about the PSMT, and we would encourage you to jump on and have a look at, for example, the structure of a report, and some of the language documents there, maybe vocab lists. We would also encourage you to use the language of the topic that you're currently covering, the task sheet, so the information given to you in the context in particular, and also the criteria, the marking guide, the ISMG. All that language is really handy. So we'll talk about assumptions and observations later on, but if you're writing about your assumptions, use the word assumption. It does make it really easy for the markers to allocate marks to you. Avoid ambiguity and be really specific. It's not a persuasive essay, but we would like you to be factual and concise. And I've skipped the one about cognitive verbs as well. There's a cognitive verb list available. We'd love you to use those. We've got a dot point here about third person. It's actually not as important as we used to think it was. But if you can, then do. But just make sure you're consistent. Using titles to signpost where you are is really great. So I would be using titles that relate directly to the criteria sheet. Here are my assumptions and observations. Here's my strengths and limitations. Here's where I'm discussing reasonableness, for example. And your assignment should, and this is on the criteria sheet for communication, so it needs to include an introduction, body, and conclusion. Now, generally speaking, your introduction is going to be somewhere from a couple of sentences at the start to maybe the whole formulate section that you design that. And your conclusion is probably going to be a few sentences at the end, maybe your strengths, limitations, and your reasonableness. But either way, the bulk of your work is in the body. So just keep that in mind. So a little bit about structure. You really should start with an opening paragraph that explains the task. And we'll note again, it needs to be able to be independently read of the task sheet. So you can give this to any teacher, even if they don't know what the task is, and they can read it and understand what you've done. You need to discuss how you intend to solve the task. This is formulate dot point 3, and we'll get to that soon, but that's really important. And you may also include in your introduction assumptions and observations, dot point 1 and 2, so it can be a table, dot point list. So don't forget, this is a math task. We don't need it to be just paragraph on paragraph on paragraph. You can use dot points and tables, etc., but you can also use paragraphs. If you do use paragraphs and you're talking about assumptions and observations, just keep it to one idea per paragraph. Don't hide a lot of ideas in one paragraph because that makes it very hard for the marker to allocate marks to you. The body, which is the developing a solution section, will typically have your mathematical solution, which will be based on the assumptions that you've made earlier. It may have some justification of decisions. So this could be done as decisions are made, and it typically is, but we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And it will include an explanation for what has been done, how it's been done, and why it's been done. You'll ensure that any mathematical working and explanation is in logical order, clearly written and easy to follow. So just take note of the information there. You will need to put an evaluation in, and this is probably part of the body. So you'll have your strengths and limitations. We'll get to that. This is criteria 3. And you'll be justifying your reasonableness and maybe talking about your decisions depending on the structure you put together. So we'll talk more about these specific things, but there's some information there for you as well if you want to have a read of that. And lastly, you'll need to put in a conclusion, which doesn't have to be long, but there's a couple of things to do here. Make sure, first of all, that you do a light summary of the task so that you've got just some ideas and you've written up the significant contributing factors there. But also make sure you rewrite your solution, just in brief, so we've got a really clearly defined moment where you definitely solved the task. Lastly, there's some referencing expectations. Now, again, we're not going to specifically go through and check that every full stop, comma, semicolon is in the right place. There isn't really a spot in our criteria for that type of nuance. But we are expecting APA referencing as per the college diary, and we're expecting it to be neat, tidy, and easy to follow. So just make sure you've referenced everything. In the past, people have thrown references in that actually link to websites that were relevant to the task. Don't just put references in for the sake of it. If you've only got 3 references, that's fine. It really depends on the task. Just make sure they're appropriate, and when we do follow up those references, that they actually fit the task and what you've said. Okay, so that's the end of video 2. Thanks for watching.